I was sitting in my sewing room, hemming a dress for my neighbor's granddaughter's wedding, when my son Kieran walked in without knocking. He had that look on his face, the one that meant he'd already made a decision about my life without asking me. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, avoiding my eyes. What I didn't know was that in less than 24 hours, I'd be wheeled into Sunset Manor retirement home with nothing but a small suitcase, and that 3 years later, my face would be staring back at him from the cover of Vogue magazine with the headline, "The 78-year-old fashion revolutionary who's redefining style for every age." But let me back up and tell you how I got there. For the past 15 years, ever since my husband Vincent passed away, I'd been living a quiet life in our old craftsman house in Millbrook. Every morning, I'd wake up at 5:30 a.m., make my coffee, and check my small alterations business that I ran from my sewing room. Nothing fancy, just helping neighbors with hemming, taking in waistlines, and fixing zippers. I'd always had an eye for style, even worked as a seamstress at a bridal shop in my younger days before having children. My son Kieran and his wife Delphine lived just 20 minutes away with their twin daughters, Sage and Iris. They were good kids but busy with their own lives. Kieran worked as a regional manager for a pharmaceutical company, always stressed about quotas and corporate politics. Delphine taught elementary school and was constantly overwhelmed with lesson plans and parent conferences. I saw them maybe once a month, usually when they needed something, help with the girls' school uniforms, or alterations for Delphine's work clothes. I didn't mind. That's what family does. I'd teach the twins basic sewing skills occasionally, showing them how to hem their own clothes or add decorative touches to their school projects. They were creative kids, always asking about different fabrics and why certain styles worked better than others. My routine was simple but satisfying. I had my weekly church group where I helped organize clothing drives for families in need. I volunteered at the local community center, teaching basic sewing skills to young mothers. And I kept busy in my sewing room, constantly working on alterations and occasionally designing little outfits for the church choir or local theater productions. That morning started like any other. I was carefully pinning a complex alteration on a vintage dress when Kieran burst through my front door, his face flushed with frustration. Behind him, Delphine stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. "Mom, we've been calling you all morning," Kieran said, his voice sharp with impatience. "Your phone was off the hook again." I glanced at the rotary phone on my kitchen counter. I'd taken it off the hook while working on the intricate beadwork. I hated interruptions when I was concentrating. I was working on Mrs. Patterson's dress for her anniversary party. You know how delicate beadwork can be. "This is exactly what we're talking about," Delphine interjected, stepping into the room. "You're becoming absent-minded. Yesterday, you forgot to pick up Sage from ballet, and last week you showed up to church on Tuesday thinking it was Sunday." My heart sank. Those incidents had been honest mistakes. I'd been so absorbed in a particularly challenging sewing project that I'd lost track of time and days. But I'd apologized and made it right. "That's not," I started, but Kieran cut me off. "Mom, we found you in the grocery store parking lot last month, sitting in your car for 2 hours because you couldn't remember where you parked. The manager called us." I remembered that day differently. I'd been waiting for the rain to stop and had dozed off. But the way they were looking at me, like I was some fragile, broken thing, made me question my own memory. "We're worried about you living alone," Delphine said, her voice softer now but somehow more frightening. "What if something happens? What if you fall or forget to turn off the stove?" "I'm fine," I protested, gesturing to my sewing room where dozens of perfectly completed projects hung organized by client and due date. "Look at my work. Does this look like someone who's losing her mind?" But they weren't really looking. They'd already decided. "We've found a beautiful place," Kieran said, pulling out a brochure. "Sunset Manor. It's only 30 minutes away, and they have activities, social events, proper meals. You'll be safe there." The word safe hit me like a slap. Safe meant controlled. Safe meant the end of my independence. You can't be serious, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm not ready for a retirement home. I have clients depending on me, commitments to the church. My life is here. Kieran's jaw tightened. Mom, you're 78 years old. It's time to accept that you can't do everything you used to do. I'm doing everything just fine, I shot back, my voice rising. I run a business, I volunteer, I take care of myself. A few minor slip-ups don't mean I'm incompetent. Minor slip-ups? Delphine stepped forward, her teacher voice coming out. You left the iron on all night last week. You could have burned the house down. That stung because it was true. I'd been so tired after working on 3 rush orders that I'd forgotten to turn off my pressing iron. But nothing had happened. The automatic shutoff had worked perfectly. And what about your bills? Kieran continued. We found stack of unpaid notices in your mailbox. The electric company called us threatening to shut off your power. I was waiting for Mrs. Chen to pay for her daughter's prom dress alterations, I explained. I always pay my bills on time once I collect from my clients. That's not how bills work, Mom, Kieran said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. You can't just wait around for payment. What if your clients don't pay? What if you get sick and can't work? I've been managing my finances for 60 years, I said, my hands shaking with frustration. I raised you, put you through college, ran this household after your father died. I'm not some helpless old woman. Delphine exchanged a look with Kieran that made my stomach drop. They'd obviously discussed this at length before coming here. The decision is made, Kieran said firmly. We've already put a deposit down. The room is available starting tomorrow. Tomorrow? The word came out as a croak. You're kidding, right? We've been trying to have this conversation for months, Delphine said. But you always change the subject or get distracted by your sewing. We can't wait anymore. You can't just decide my life for me, I said, standing up from my sewing chair. I'm an adult. I have rights. Mom, don't make this harder than it needs to be, Kieran said, his voice exhausted. We're doing this because we love you. But love doesn't feel like being ambushed in your own home. Love doesn't feel like having your independence stripped away without warning. That night, as I sat in my sewing room surrounded by half-finished projects and fabrics I'd collected over decades, the full weight of my situation hit me. I wasn't just losing my home, I was losing my identity. After Vincent died, this sewing room had become my sanctuary. When grief threatened to swallow me whole, I'd come here and create something beautiful. When loneliness crept in during the long winter nights, I'd work on intricate embroidery that required my full attention. When my arthritis flared up and I felt old and useless, I designed something that made a client feel beautiful and confident. I thought about all the women I'd helped over the years. Nervous brides who needed their grandmother's dress altered to fit perfectly. Teenage girls who couldn't afford prom dresses but looked stunning in creations I'd made from clearance fabric. Professional women who needed their power suits tailored to give them confidence in boardrooms. Each stitch had been a small act of service, a way to help someone feel their best. But Kieran and Delphine saw none of that. They saw an old woman who occasionally forgot things, who sometimes prioritized her craft over their convenience. They saw liability, not legacy. I realized then that this had been building for years. The subtle comments about my little hobby, the way they'd roll their eyes when I mentioned a particularly challenging project, the times they'd suggest I slow down or take it easy. They'd never seen my work as real work, never understood that my alterations business wasn't just a way to pass time, it was my purpose. I thought about all the times I'd dropped everything to help them. When Delphine needed costumes for her school play, I'd worked 3 straight nights to finish them. When Kieran needed his suit altered for his promotion ceremony, I'd canceled my other appointments to get it done. When the twins needed Halloween costumes, I'd created elaborate outfits that won school contests. But those weren't favors. They were expectations. My time, my skills, my creativity were just resources they could tap into when needed. And now that I was becoming inconvenient, it was time to put me somewhere safe, where I wouldn't be their problem anymore. The most painful part was realizing that they genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. They weren't cruel people. They were just people who had never really seen me as anything more than mom, a role that apparently came with an expiration date. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity. As I made my coffee in the kitchen where I'd prepared thousands of family meals, as I looked at the sewing room where I'd created beauty for 15 years, I realized something profound. I was done fighting for people who had already written me off. When Kieran arrived with a small moving crew, hired without consulting me, I didn't argue. I watched them pack my entire life into boxes with clinical efficiency. My fabric collection, carefully organized by color and texture, was crammed into garbage bags. My vintage sewing machine, a 1960s Singer that had been my constant companion, was wrapped in bubble wrap like it was already headed for storage. "We'll keep the important stuff safe," Kieran assured me, not understanding that it was all important to me. I packed a single suitcase with basic clothes, my reading glasses, and one photo of Vincent and me on our wedding day. I left behind my measuring tapes, my pattern collection, my button box, all the tools that had defined my daily life for decades. At Sunset Manor, the intake coordinator, Mrs. Blankenship, spoke about me like I wasn't there. "She'll need assistance with medication management," Kieran explained, "and she sometimes gets confused about dates and appointments." I wanted to scream that I'd never missed taking my blood pressure medication, that I'd only been confused because I'd been absorbed in creative work. But I said nothing. What was the point? My room was sterile and beige, a hospital bed, a small dresser, one chair by the window. The view was of the parking lot. After 6 decades of surrounding myself with color and texture and beauty, I was going to stare at asphalt. "You'll love it here, Mom," Kieran said, his voice bright with forced enthusiasm. "They have bingo on Tuesdays and movie nights, and the food is supposed to be really good." He hugged me goodbye like it was temporary, like this was just a trial run. But I knew better. People didn't leave retirement homes. They died there. That first night, I lay in the narrow bed listening to unfamiliar sounds. Mrs. Kowalski next door watching TV too loud, someone's oxygen machine humming in the distance, the squeak of nurses' shoes on linoleum. I thought about my sewing room, now probably being converted into Delphine's home office or a playroom for the twins. I was 78 years old, and my life as I knew it was over. At least, that's what I thought. 3 weeks into my stay at Sunset Manor, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to start sewing again, whether they liked it or not. It started small. I noticed Estelle, the woman across the hall, struggling with a torn sweater. The sleeve had caught on her wheelchair and ripped clean through. She was heartbroken. It was a gift from her late husband, soft yellow cashmere that brought out her eyes. "The activities director said they might be able to find someone in town to fix it," she said sadly. "But it could take weeks, and it might not match perfectly." "Let me see it," I said, examining the tear carefully. It was a clean rip, easily mendable with the right technique. "I used to do alterations. I could fix this for you." "But you don't have supplies," she pointed out. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since arriving. I called a taxi and left the premises. Officially, residents weren't supposed to leave without family approval, but I wasn't a prisoner. I went to the local craft store and spent $200 of my own money on basic supplies. Needles, thread in every color imaginable, fabric scissors, a small embroidery hoop, and a portable sewing kit. When I returned, Mrs. Blankenship was waiting for me with pursed lips. "Mrs. Caldwell, you can't just leave without informing staff. What if there had been an emergency?" "I'm 78, not 8, I replied calmly. "I went shopping. I'll do it again whenever I need to." That evening, I sat in the common room and carefully mended Estelle's sweater. The work felt like meditation. My fingers remembered every technique, every stitch pattern. Other residents gathered around, watching with fascination as I made the tear disappear so completely, it looked like it had never existed. "That's incredible," whispered Dorothy, a former librarian who rarely spoke. "It looks brand new." "Better than new," Estelle said. tears in her eyes as she held up the perfectly repaired sweater. "It's like magic." Word spread quickly through Sunset Manor. By the end of the week, I had a waiting list. Harold needed his favorite polo shirt mended. Margaret had a vintage dress that needed the zipper replaced. Frank wanted his military uniform altered to fit his changing body for his grandson's wedding. But I didn't just fix their clothes. I improved them. I added small embellishments, adjusted fits to be more flattering, replaced ugly buttons with beautiful ones I'd found at the craft store. I made their clothes work for their bodies as they were now, not as they used to be. For the first time since arriving, I felt alive again. Within 2 months, I had completely transformed the social dynamic at Sunset Manor. What started as simple mending had evolved into something much bigger. I was teaching residents how to look and feel their best. I convinced the activities director, a sweet young woman named Carmen, to let me start a fashion and confidence workshop. Every Tuesday and Thursday, a dozen residents would gather in the sunroom while I taught them basic alterations, color coordination, and most importantly, how to dress for the bodies they had now. "Fashion doesn't stop at 65, I would tell them, pinning a hem on Ruth's dress to show off her still gorgeous legs. It just gets more intentional." I started documenting our transformations. Carmen's daughter had given her an old digital camera, and I learned to use it to take before and after photos. The changes were remarkable, not just in how people looked, but in how they carried themselves. Posture improved. Smiles became more frequent. The dining room, once filled with residents in institutional-looking clothes, now buzzed with color and personality. Margaret, who hadn't worn anything but sweatpants for 3 years, was now sporting perfectly tailored slacks and silk blouses. Harold had discovered that certain colors made his eyes sparkle, and he'd started combing his hair again. Dorothy had emerged from her shell completely, organizing fashion shows where residents could display their newly altered outfits. But the real breakthrough came when I started designing original pieces specifically for seniors. The fashion industry had forgotten about people over 70, creating clothes that were either frumpy and shapeless or trying too hard to be youthful. I began creating elegant, age-appropriate designs that celebrated the beauty of older bodies. I designed wrap dresses that were easy to put on for arthritic hands but still looked sophisticated. I created pants with hidden elastic waists that looked tailored but felt comfortable. I made blouses with magnetic closures disguised as regular buttons for residents with limited dexterity. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Residents who had felt invisible for years were suddenly getting compliments from their visiting families. Children and grandchildren were asking, "Grandma, you look amazing! Where did you get that outfit?" And they would proudly answer, "Margaret made it for me. She lives here, and she's incredible." I started getting requests from other retirement communities. Word was spreading through the network of adult children who visited their parents. Someone who knew someone had heard about the remarkable seamstress at Sunset Manor who was making miracles happen. I was no longer just surviving in the retirement home. I was thriving. And for the first time 6 months later, I was running a full-scale fashion consultation business from my retirement homeroom. My little corner of Sunset Manor had become a design studio with fabric samples, sketches, and a growing collection of adaptive clothing patterns I developed specifically for seniors. The turning point came when Evelyn Martinez, a 72-year-old former executive, approached me with a problem. Her granddaughter was getting married, and she wanted to look elegant but couldn't find anything that worked with her walker and recent hip replacement. "Everything in the stores looks like it's for someone half my age or like a hospital gown," she said, frustrated. "I want to look like myself, just the best version of myself." I designed her a stunning navy blue dress with a sophisticated A-line cut that accommodated her walker gracefully, with hidden support panels and a jacket that could be easily removed if she got warm. The dress was photographed at the wedding and went viral on social media when the bride posted about her incredible grandmother, who looked like she stepped out of a magazine. That post changed everything. Suddenly, I was getting calls from adult children across the country asking if I could help their parents. The waiting list grew to over 200 people. I was working 12-hour days and loving every minute of it. I hired 3 other residents as assistants, former teachers and nurses who had excellent attention to detail and were thrilled to have purpose again. We turned the unused craft room into a proper workshop, complete with professional sewing machines that I ordered online. Then came the media attention. A local newspaper did a feature story about the senior fashion revolution happening at Sunset Manor. A lifestyle blogger interviewed me about aging with style. A regional magazine wanted to do a photo spread of my designs. But the real breakthrough came when I launched my website, Silver Threads by Margaret. I partnered with Carmen's tech-savvy daughter to create an online platform where I could sell my patterns, offer virtual consultations, and ship custom-made pieces to seniors across the country. The business exploded. My adaptive clothing line filled a massive gap in the market. I was making more money than I'd ever made in my life. And more importantly, I was helping thousands of people feel beautiful and confident in their own skin. By the end of my first year at Sunset Manor, I had gone from a forgotten woman in a beige room to the CEO of a revolutionary fashion company. I was 79 years old, and I was just getting started. That's when Kieran and Delphine came back into my life. I was in the middle of a video call with a fashion journalist from New York when Carmen knocked on my door. "Margaret, your son is here. He seems upset." I could hear Kieran's voice echoing down the hallway before I even ended the call. "What do you mean she's running a business? She's supposed to be retired. She's supposed to be resting." When I opened my door, I found Kieran and Delphine standing in the hallway with Mrs. Blankenship, all 3 of them looking like they'd witnessed a crime. My room, which had been transformed into a sophisticated design studio, was clearly not what they'd expected to find. "Mom, what is all this?" Kieran gestured at my organized workspace, the professional lighting I'd installed, the mannequins displaying my latest designs. "It's my business," I said calmly. "Silver Threads by Margaret. Perhaps you've heard of it. We've been featured in several major publications." Delphine stepped forward, her elementary school teacher voice in full force. "Margaret, this is getting out of hand. You're supposed to be taking it easy, not working harder than ever." "I'm not working harder," I replied. "I'm working smarter, and I'm working on something I'm passionate about." "But you're old," Kieran exploded. "You're in a retirement home. You can't just decide to start a fashion empire at 79 inches. "Watch me," I said, and I meant it. Mrs. Blankenship cleared her throat nervously. "We've been getting complaints from some families. They feel that Mrs. Caldwell is setting unrealistic expectations for their parents. Some residents are becoming demanding about their appearance. God forbid elderly people should want to look nice," I said dryly. "It's not about looking nice," Delphine said. "It's about you encouraging these people to think they can still do things they can't do. You're giving them false hope." "False hope?" I stared at her. "I'm giving them exactly what you took away from me, the right to define their own lives." "Mom, we're worried about you," Kieran said, his voice softening slightly. "This is a lot of stress for someone your age. What if you have a heart attack? What if you make a mistake that hurts your reputation?" "What if I don't?" I countered. "What if I succeed beyond your wildest imagination? What if I prove that being 79 doesn't mean I'm dead?" The room fell silent. I realized that this was the conversation we should have had 2 years ago, before they'd made decisions about my life without consulting me. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in the Sunset Manor sunroom when Carmen burst in with a magazine in her hands, her eyes wide with excitement. "Margaret, you need to see this," she said, practically vibrating with energy. "You need to see this right now." She handed me the latest issue of Vogue, and there on the cover was a photo of me in one of my own designs, an elegant burgundy dress with intricate beadwork that I'd made for a photo shoot. The headline read, "The 78-year-old fashion revolutionary who's redefining style for every age." I stared at the cover, my hands trembling slightly. Vogue, the fashion Bible, the magazine that had represented everything glamorous and unattainable for my entire life. And there I was, a 78-year-old woman in a retirement home, staring back at myself. The article is 6 pages long, Carmen said, flipping through excitedly. They're calling you a visionary and a pioneer. They say you're single-handedly changing how the fashion industry thinks about older consumers. I read the article with growing amazement. The journalist had spent hours interviewing me about my philosophy, my designs, and my journey from abandoned grandmother to fashion mogul. She'd interviewed my residents, my clients, even other designers who were now creating adaptive clothing lines inspired by my work. Margaret Caldwell isn't just designing clothes, the article read. She's designing dignity. She's proving that style doesn't have an expiration date, and that innovation can come from the most unexpected places. The article mentioned my business revenue. Silver Threads by Margaret had generated over $2 million in sales in just 18 months. I was featured alongside established designers, my work photographed in the same artistic style as haute couture collections. But the most powerful part of the article was the personal story. The journalist had somehow tracked down details about how I'd ended up at Sunset Manor, and she'd painted a picture of a woman who had refused to let circumstances define her. When her son placed her in a retirement home, believing her productive years were over, Margaret Caldwell proved that sometimes the third act is the most magnificent of all. As I sat there holding the magazine, I heard familiar voices in the hallway. Kieran and Delphine were back, and this time they weren't alone. I could hear multiple voices, urgent and excited. "Excuse me," I heard Kieran say to Carmen. "We're looking for my mother." "Margaret Caldwell? We heard she was featured in a magazine?" Carmen's voice was cool as she responded. "You mean the internationally renowned fashion designer?" "Yes, she's in the sunroom, but she's very busy these days. Perhaps you should make an appointment." I couldn't help but smile. When Kieran, Delphine, and what appeared to be half their extended family crowded into the sunroom, their faces were a mixture of shock, excitement, and something that looked suspiciously like greed. "Mom!" Kieran rushed forward, trying to hug me. "We saw the magazine!" "We can't believe it. You're famous!" I didn't get up from my chair. I simply held the Vogue magazine in my lap and looked at them calmly. "Yes, I am." "We're so proud of you," Delphine gushed, suddenly all smiles. "We always knew you were talented, but this is incredible." "Did you?" I asked quietly. "Because I remember you telling me I was giving people false hope. I remember you saying I was too old to work." Kieran had the grace to look embarrassed. "Mom, we were just worried about your health. We had no idea you could do something like this." "That's exactly the problem," I said, my voice steady and clear. "You had no idea who I was or what I was capable of. You saw a problem to be solved, not a person to be valued." "But we're here now," Delphine said, her voice taking on that bright, fake cheerfulness she used with difficult students. "We want to support you. We want to help." "Help with what exactly?" I asked. Kieran pulled out his phone, his excitement barely contained. "Well, you'll need help managing all this success. The business side of things, marketing, investments. I could take a leave of absence from my job, help you organize everything properly." There it was, the real reason for their sudden interest. "And we could move you back home," Delphine added quickly. "You shouldn't be running a fashion empire from a retirement home. We could convert the garage into a proper studio, hire assistants, make this a real family business." I looked around the sunroom at my residence, my friends, my team, my chosen family. Estelle was wearing the yellow sweater I'd mended, now paired with a silk scarf I'd designed. Harold had on the perfectly tailored blazer I'd altered for him. Dorothy was sketching design ideas for our next collection, her artistic talents finally being put to use again. "This is already a real business," I said firmly, "and this is already my real family." "But Mom," Kieran said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I remembered so well, "you can't want to stay in a retirement home forever. Don't you want to come home?" I stood up slowly, the Vogue magazine still in my hands. "Kieran, I want you to listen to me very carefully. This is my home now. These people are my family now. You placed me here when you thought I was useless, and I built something beautiful. I'm not leaving." You don't mean that, Delphine said, her smile faltering. I absolutely mean it, I replied. You're welcome to visit, but I'm not your project to manage or your asset to capitalize on. I'm a successful businesswoman who happens to be your mother, in that order. The silence that followed was deafening. 2 years later, I'm sitting in my beautiful corner office at the Sunset Manor Fashion Institute, the first design school specifically created for and by seniors. The retirement home has been transformed into a revolutionary concept, a place where older adults don't just wait to die, but continue to create, innovate, and inspire. My business, Silver Threads by Margaret, now employs over 50 people across the country, most of them over 65. We've launched 3 successful clothing lines, opened an online learning platform, and just signed a partnership with a major department store chain to carry our adaptive fashion line. The Vogue cover was just the beginning. I've been featured in Time magazine, given a TED Talk about ageism in the fashion industry, and been invited to speak at design schools across the country. My book, Never Too Late, A Guide to Reinventing Yourself at Any Age, hit the bestseller list last month. But the real victory isn't the magazine covers or the money. It's the letters I get every day from people who tell me I've changed their lives. Seniors who thought their best years were behind them, who've now started businesses, gone back to school, or simply started dressing with confidence again. Kieran and Delphine visit occasionally, and our relationship is cordial but distant. They still don't quite understand what happened, how the mother they'd written off as a burden became a person they read about in magazines. But they've learned to respect my choices, even if they don't fully comprehend them. The twins, now teenagers, spend their summer breaks working as interns at the Fashion Institute. They're learning that age is just a number, that creativity doesn't have an expiration date, and that their grandmother is pretty amazing. Last week, I got a letter from an 82-year-old woman in Florida who'd seen my story on the news. She'd been placed in a nursing home by her family after a minor stroke, and she'd given up hope. But she'd started painting again after reading about my journey, and now she's having her first art show in 30 years. You showed me that being put somewhere isn't the same as being put away, she wrote. You showed me that our stories don't end when other people stop listening. Every morning, I wake up in my suite at Sunset Manor. They've upgraded my accommodations considerably since my Vogue cover, and I look out at the garden where residents tend flowers and vegetables they've designed themselves. I see people in their 70s, 80s, and 90s walking with purpose, dressed in clothes that make them feel beautiful, working on projects that give them joy. I'm 81 now, and I'm not slowing down. I'm designing a new collection inspired by the wisdom lines that map our faces, the gentle curves that time has given our bodies, the silver threads that run through our hair like precious metal. Because I've learned that the third act isn't about winding down. It's about finally becoming exactly who you were always meant to be. And sometimes that happens in the most unexpected